My name is Sarah, and I was 12 years old when everything I believed about my family shattered like glass against concrete. It happened during what was supposed to be our perfect summer vacation, a 2-week road trip across the country that my parents had been planning for months. Dad had marked every stop on his old atlas with red circles. Mom had packed enough snacks to feed a small army. And my little brother Tommy kept asking if we were there yet before we even left the driveway. I remember feeling so excited that morning, my stomach fluttering with anticipation as I watched Dad load our suitcases into the back of our blue minivan. The sun was barely peeking over the horizon, painting our suburban street in golden hues, and everything felt magical and full of promise. Mom was humming while she made sandwiches for the road, her long brown hair catching the kitchen light as she moved around with that graceful efficiency she always had. Tommy was bouncing on his toes, clutching his favorite stuffed elephant, Mr. Peanuts, asking a million questions about where we would sleep and what we would see. Dad kept checking his watch and muttering about traffic, but I could see the excitement in his eyes too, the way they crinkled at the corners when he was truly happy. We were going to see the Grand Canyon, Yellowstone, Mount Rushmore, all those places I had only seen in picture books and documentaries. It was going to be the adventure of a lifetime, the kind of trip that would give us stories to tell for years to come. I had packed my journal, planning to document every single moment, every funny thing Tommy said, every beautiful sunset we witnessed together. The first few hours were exactly what I had imagined. We played road trip games, sang along to the radio, and stopped at quirky roadside attractions that made us laugh until our stomachs hurt. Dad bought us all matching baseball caps at a gas station in Nebraska, and Mom took pictures of us wearing them, grinning like fools in front of the world's largest ball of twine. Tommy fell asleep against my shoulder, his little body warm and trusting, while Mom and Dad talked quietly in the front seat about work and bills and boring, grown-up things that seemed so unimportant compared to the adventure stretching out before us. But somewhere around the third day, when we stopped at that little motel in Colorado with the flickering neon sign and the musty rooms that smelled like cigarettes and disappointment, something began to change. It started small, almost imperceptible, like a crack in a dam that would eventually bring down everything we had built together as a family. The motel room had thin walls, paper thin it seemed, and I could hear everything through the wall that separated our adjoining rooms. Mom and Dad had gotten the room next to ours, while Tommy and I shared the other one with 2 twin beds and a broken air conditioner that made more noise than cool air. I was lying in bed, listening to Tommy's soft breathing and trying to fall asleep despite the humidity when I heard voices from the next room. At first, I thought nothing of it. Parents talk, right? They discuss the next day's plans, worry about budgets, complain about driving distances and uncomfortable hotel beds. But as the minutes ticked by and their voices grew more intense, I realized this was different. There was an edge to their conversation that I had never heard before, a sharpness that made my chest tighten with anxiety. I pressed my ear against the wall, telling myself I was just being curious, not really eavesdropping, just wanting to make sure everything was okay. Mom's voice was strained, almost pleading, and I could hear her saying something about can't. Keep doing this, and the kids don't deserve this. Dad's responses were muffled, but his tone was defensive, occasionally rising to a level that made me wince. They were fighting, really fighting, not the gentle disagreements I sometimes witnessed. At home over what movie to watch or where to order dinner from. This was something deeper, something that had been festering beneath the surface of our seemingly perfect family dynamic. I heard Mom mention a name I didn't recognize, a woman's name that made Dad's voice go quiet for a long moment before erupting. and what sounded like justifications and explanations that seemed to satisfy no one. My 12-year-old brain struggled to process what I was hearing, to make sense of the fragments of conversation that drifted through the thin motel wall like smoke. Words like affair and betrayal and how could you pierced through my confusion, sharp and painful like shards of glass. I pulled my pillow over my head, trying to block out the sound, but it was too late. The damage was done. The perfect image I had of my family, of my parents' marriage, of our happy little unit traveling across the country together, was crumbling before my eyes. I lay there in the darkness, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might wake Tommy, trying to convince myself that I had misunderstood, that there was some innocent explanation for what I was hearing. But deep down, in that place where children keep their most frightening truths, I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Asterisk morning came with a brutal brightness that seemed to mock my sleepless night. Tommy woke up cheerful and oblivious, chattering about pancakes and asking if we could swim in the motel pool before we left. I watched him bounce around the room, his innocence intact and beautiful, and felt a fierce protectiveness wash over me. He didn't need to know what I had heard. He didn't need to carry this weight that was already pressing down on my shoulders like a lead blanket. When Mom knocked on our door, she looked tired but composed, her makeup carefully applied to hide whatever traces of last night's emotional storm might have lingered on her face. She smiled at us, that practiced mom smile that I was only now beginning to recognize as a mask, and announced that we were going to skip breakfast at the motel and find a nice diner down the road instead. Dad was loading the van when we came outside, his movements sharp and efficient, but he wouldn't meet my eyes when I said good morning. The tension between my parents was palpable, like electricity in the air before a thunderstorm, but they were both trying so hard to act normal that their performance felt almost theatrical. During breakfast at a cheerful roadside diner with checkered tablecloths and a waitress who called everyone honey, I watched my parents interact with new eyes. I noticed how Dad's laugh sounded forced when Mom made a joke about the oversized portions. I saw how Mom's smile never quite reached her eyes, even when Tommy spilled syrup all over himself and she was cleaning him up with gentle efficiency. They were going through the motions of being a happy family, but now I could see the cracks in their performance, the places where their real emotions leaked through despite their best efforts. The rest of that day passed in a strange, surreal haze. We visited a tourist trap called Mystery Spot, where everything was supposed to be tilted and gravity worked differently, but I felt like I was the one living in a world where nothing made sense anymore. Tommy delighted in the optical illusions and impossible physics demonstrations, while I stood there feeling like I was watching my family through a funhouse mirror, everything distorted and wrong. Mom and Dad kept up their cheerful commentary, pointing out interesting sights and making plans for the next day's destinations, but their words felt hollow to me now, like actors reading lines from a script they didn't really believe in. That night, we stayed at a nicer hotel, one with thick walls and better soundproofing, but I lay awake anyway, staring at the ceiling and trying to process everything I had learned about the adult world in the span of 24 hours. The days that followed took on a dreamlike quality, as if I were floating through our vacation in a bubble of hyper-awareness. Every interaction between my parents became a puzzle for me to solve, every glance and gesture loaded with meaning that I desperately tried to decode. I started paying attention to things I had never noticed before, like how Dad would check his phone constantly when he thought no one was looking, or how Mom's jaw would clench whenever he did it. I noticed that they stopped touching each other. Casually, those little intimate gestures that married couples share without thinking. The brief hand on a shoulder or fingers brushing while passing the salt. The absence of these small connections felt enormous to me, like a chasm that was widening with each passing mile. We visited the Grand Canyon on day 6, and I stood at the rim looking out at that vast, beautiful emptiness while my family posed. For pictures behind me, Dad had his arm around Mom's waist, and she was smiling brightly at the camera. But I could see the stiffness in her posture, the way she held herself slightly apart from him even as she leaned into the embrace. Tommy was making faces at the camera, completely oblivious to the undercurrents of tension that seemed so obvious to me now. Later, as we were walking back to the parking area, I heard Mom tell Dad that she needed some time to think, and he responded with something about not ruining the vacation for the kids. The irony was bitter in my mouth because the vacation was already ruined for me, had been ruined from the moment I pressed my ear against that motel wall and learned that adults could lie so convincingly about the most important things in their lives. That evening, we had dinner at a restaurant overlooking the canyon, and I watched the sunset paint the rocks in brilliant shades of orange and red while my parents made stilted conversation about the geological formations and the history of the area. Tommy kept trying to get everyone to play I Spy, but the game felt forced and artificial, like everything else we were doing. I excused myself to go to the bathroom and found myself crying in the stall, overwhelmed by the weight of knowledge I was too young to carry and too protective of my family to share. When I came back to the table, Mom looked at me with concern and asked if I was feeling okay, if maybe I was getting carsick from all the winding mountain roads. I nodded and said I was fine, adding another lie to the growing collection that seemed to be holding our family together with increasingly fragile threads. By the time we reached Yellowstone, I had become an expert at reading the subtle signs of my parents' disintegrating marriage. I could predict when they were about to have another whispered argument by the set of Dad's shoulders or the way Mom would suddenly become very interested in folding and refolding her clothes. I learned to distract Tommy during the worst moments, suggesting games or activities that would keep his attention away from the tension that seemed to follow us like a storm cloud. At Old Faithful, we waited with crowds of other tourists for the famous geyser to erupt, and I watched families around us laughing and taking selfies and generally enjoying their vacations in the uncomplicated way that we had been doing just a week earlier. A little girl about Tommy's age was shrieking with delight every time the geyser shot water into the air, while her parents captured her joy on their phones with expressions of pure love and contentment. I felt a sharp pang of envy watching them, remembering when that had been us, when my parents looked at each other with genuine affection instead of carefully maintained politeness, when Old Faithful finally erupted in all its geological glory. Tommy clapped and cheered while Mom and Dad stood on opposite sides of him, both taking pictures but never of each other. That night, in our cabin at the lodge, I heard them talking again through the thin walls, their voices low but urgent. This time, I caught fragments about lawyers and custody and how to tell the children, words that made my blood run cold with their implications. I lay in my narrow bunk bed, listening to Tommy's peaceful breathing from the bed below mine, and realized that this trip was never going to end the way it was supposed to. We weren't going to drive home in 2 weeks with photo albums full of happy memories and stories to tell our friends about our amazing family adventure. Instead, we were going to return to a house that might not be home to all 4 of us much longer, to a life that was going to be fundamentally different from the one we had left behind. The next morning, Mom announced that we were going to change our itinerary slightly, that instead of continuing north to Mount Rushmore as planned, we were going to head east toward home. She said it with forced brightness, claiming that she had been checking the weather forecast and there were storms predicted for the Black Hills region that might make sightseeing unpleasant. Dad didn't contradict her, just nodded and started packing our bags with the same mechanical efficiency he had been displaying for days. Tommy was disappointed about missing Mount Rushmore, but he accepted the change with the resilience of childhood. already excited about the prospect of sleeping in his own bed sooner than expected. The drive home was the longest 2 days of my life. We took a more direct route, skipping the scenic detours and roadside attractions that had made the first part of our trip so magical. The atmosphere in the van was thick with unspoken truths and accumulated resentments, made worse by the fact that we were all trapped together in that small space with nowhere to escape. Tommy sensed that something was wrong, finally, his childish intuition picking up on the tension that had become impossible to hide. He grew clingy and whiny, asking repeatedly if we were mad at him, if he had done something to make everyone so quiet and sad. Mom reassured him with extra hugs and forced smiles, while Dad retreated further into himself, speaking only when directly addressed and then only in monosyllables. I found myself becoming the family mediator, suggesting games and sing-alongs. To break the oppressive silence, making jokes that fell flat, desperately trying to recapture some semblance of the happiness we had started the trip with. But it was like trying to hold water in my cupped hands, everything important slipping through my fingers, no matter how tightly I tried to grasp it. We stopped for lunch at a chain restaurant off the highway, one of those places with plastic booth seats and laminated menus that serve the same food in every location across the country. Tommy wanted to sit next to Dad, but Dad was on his phone again, typing messages with a focused intensity that made Mom's face go very still and cold. She ordered for all of us without asking what anyone wanted, her voice clipped and efficient. And when the waitress brought her drinks, she knocked over Tommy's chocolate milk with a sudden, jerky movement that seemed to surprise even her. The cleanup became a production, with paper towels and apologies, and Dad finally looking up from his phone to ask what happened, as if he had just realized we were there. Mom's laugh in response was bitter and sharp, nothing like the warm, musical sound I had grown up associating with her happiness. After lunch, Tommy fell asleep in his car seat, exhausted by the emotional weight he couldn't understand but was definitely feeling. I sat in the middle seat, watching the endless highway roll past and thinking about how different everything looked now compared to when we had driven the same route in the opposite direction just 2 weeks earlier. The same landscape that had seemed full of adventure and possibility on the way out now felt like a countdown to something terrible. Each mile marker bringing us closer to whatever confrontation or confession or catastrophe was waiting for us at home. We arrived home on a Sunday evening, the sun setting behind our familiar suburban street in a way that should have felt comforting but instead felt ominous. Our house looked exactly the same as when we had left it, the lawn maybe a little longer, and the mail piled up on the front porch, but otherwise unchanged. It was jarring to realize that while our family had been falling apart in motel rooms and national parks across the country, our physical home had remained constant and untouched, waiting patiently for our return. Dad unloaded the van with the same grim efficiency he had been displaying for days, carrying suitcases and coolers into the house without comment. Mom supervised Tommy's reunion with his bedroom and his toys, helping him sort through the souvenirs we had collected along the way. But I could see the effort it took for her to maintain her cheerful demeanor. I went to my own room and sat on my bed, surrounded by the familiar posters and books and stuffed animals that suddenly felt like artifacts from a previous life, back when I was younger and more naive and still believed that parents were infallible. That night, after Tommy was asleep, I heard my parents talking in the kitchen, their voices carrying up through the heating vents in a way that made me think of that first night in the motel, when everything began to unravel. But this time, they weren't trying to keep their voices down. This time, they were having the conversation they had been avoiding for 2 weeks, the one that was going to change everything. I heard Dad say that he was sorry, that he had never meant for any of this to happen, that it had just been a mistake that had gotten out of hand. Mom's response was quiet but devastating, something about trust being like a mirror, once broken. It could never be the same again, even if you put all the pieces back together. They talked about separation and counseling and what was best for the children, their voices taking on the careful, formal tone that adults use when they are discussing the end of everything they had built together. I pulled my pillow over my head, just like I had done that first night, but this time it wasn't enough to block out the reality of what was happening. The next morning, Dad was gone. Not permanently, Mom explained when Tommy asked where he was. Just staying at Grandpa's house for a little while so that he and Mom could figure some things out. Tommy accepted this explanation with the trusting nature of a 7-year-old, but I could see the confusion and fear in his eyes. The same emotions that were churning in my own stomach like a sickness that wouldn't go away. The weeks that followed. Our return were a masterclass in how quickly a life can change direction. Dad came by every few days to pick up clothes or papers, and these visits were stilted. Awkward affairs where everyone tried to act normal while navigating around the enormous elephant in the room. He would play with Tommy for a while, helping him build Lego structures or reading him stories. But there was a desperate quality to these interactions now, as if he was trying to cram as much fatherhood as possible into these brief, scheduled moments. When he talked to me, his voice was gentle but sad, asking about school and my friends and whether I was doing okay, but never directly addressing the chaos that had engulfed our family. I wanted to tell him that I knew, that I had heard everything. That night in the motel, and had been carrying this secret for weeks, that the words stuck in my throat every time I tried to speak them. Mom threw herself into creating a new normal for us, signing Tommy up for extra activities and planning elaborate weekend adventures that were supposed to distract us from Dad's absence. She started going to therapy, something she mentioned casually, one evening while making dinner, as if it were no more significant than joining a book club or taking a yoga class. I could see her working hard to hold herself together for our sake, but sometimes I caught her staring out the kitchen window with an expression of profound sadness, or standing in the doorway of her bedroom looking at the empty space where Dad's dresser used to be. School started in late August, and I found it impossible to concentrate on homework or tests or any of the things that had seemed so important just a few months earlier. My best friend Jessica kept asking what was wrong, why I was so distracted and moody. But how do you explain to someone whose parents are still happily married that your entire world has shifted on its axis? I started spending more time in the school library, losing myself in books about other people's problems, fictional families whose dramas were contained safely between covers where they couldn't hurt anyone. One day in early September, Mom sat Tommy and me down at the kitchen table after dinner and told us that she and Dad were getting divorced. She used gentle, age-appropriate language, explaining that sometimes adults realize they are better as friends than as married couples, and that this didn't change how much they both loved us. Tommy cried, his little face crumpled with confusion and grief, while I sat there feeling strangely detached, as if this was happening to someone else's family and I was just observing from a distance. The word divorce hung in the air between. Use like smoke, acrid and choking. The legal proceedings began in October, a series of meetings with lawyers and mediators that my parents attended while Tommy and I stayed with various relatives or family friends. I overheard enough phone conversations and whispered discussions to understand that things were getting complicated, that there were disagreements about custody schedules and financial support and who would keep the house. The woman whose name I had first heard through that motel wall became a more concrete presence in our lives. Not someone we met, but someone whose existence cast a shadow over every decision my parents made. Dad moved into an apartment across town, a sterile, temporary feeling place with beige walls and rental furniture that smelled like industrial carpet cleaner. Tommy and I started spending every other weekend there, sleeping on an inflatable mattress, in what Dad optimistically called the guest room, but was really just empty space with no personality or warmth. These weekend visits were exercises in awkwardness, with Dad trying too hard to be the fun parent, taking us to movies and restaurants and amusement parks in an effort to pack as much joy as possible into our limited time together. But the joy felt forced and desperate, tainted by the knowledge that these scheduled interactions were a poor substitute for the organic, everyday relationship we used to have when we all lived under the same roof. Back at home, Mom was gradually transforming our house into something that belonged just to the three of us. She rearranged furniture, painted walls, and slowly erased the physical traces of Dad's presence while trying to maintain some sense of stability for Tommy and me. She started dating again sometime in late fall, though she was discreet about it, mentioning casual dinner plans or evening activities without providing too many details. I found myself becoming hyper-vigilant about these new relationships, studying the men who occasionally appeared at our door or called during dinner, wondering if any of them might become a permanent fixture in our reconfigured family. Tommy seemed to adapt more quickly than I did, his resilient 7-year-old spirit bouncing back from the initial shock and settling into our new routine with relative ease. He made friends with the kids in Dad's apartment complex and started looking forward to our weekend visits as adventures rather than obligations. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was living in the aftermath of something catastrophic, walking through the ruins of what our family used to be and trying to pretend that this new version was just as good as the original. At school, I started paying attention to other kids whose parents were divorced, looking for clues about how to navigate this new landscape of split loyalties and divided holidays. Christmas that year was a complex negotiation of logistics and emotions that required the organizational skills of a diplomat. We spent Christmas Eve with Mom and Christmas morning with Dad, then reversed the schedule for New Year's, trying to ensure that both parents got equal time with us during the holiday season. But holidays are built on traditions and rituals that don't translate well to divided households, and every celebration felt like a performance that was missing crucial cast members. Dad's apartment was decorated with a small artificial tree and a few half-hearted strings of lights, while Mom went overboard with the decorations at our house, as if she could compensate for Dad's absence through sheer volume of holiday cheer. Tommy was excited about getting 2 sets of presents, but I found the whole arrangement exhausting and artificial. I missed the simple pleasure of waking up in my own bed on Christmas morning and padding downstairs in my pajamas to find my family already gathered around our tree, the living room warm with the glow of twinkling lights and the smell of Mom's coffee brewing in the kitchen. Instead, we had to pack overnight bags and coordinate schedules and divide our attention between 2 different households that were both trying too hard to create magical holiday memories. During our Christmas visit to Dad's apartment, he told us that he had something important to share with us. His voice was nervous but determined as he explained that there was someone special he wanted us to meet, someone who had become very important to him over the past few months. I felt my stomach drop, even though I had been expecting this moment ever since that first night in the Colorado motel. Her name was Linda, and she was the woman whose voice had shattered my childhood through thin walls and whispered arguments. Dad said that they cared about each other very much, and that he hoped we would give her a chance because she was excited to meet us and wanted to be part of our lives. Tommy asked innocent questions about who Linda was and where she lived and whether she had any kids of her own, while I sat there feeling like I was going to be sick. The idea of meeting the person who had helped destroy my parents' marriage, of being expected to welcome her into our family dynamic, felt like a betrayal. Of everything I had been taught about loyalty and commitment, and the sanctity of family bonds. But I was only 12 years old, powerless to express my rage and confusion in any way that adults would take seriously. So I nodded and smiled and said that meeting Linda sounded nice while inside. I was screaming. We met Linda the following weekend at a family restaurant that tried too hard to be cheerful with its primary colored booths and children's menus shaped like a cartoon animal. She was younger than Mom, probably in her early 30s, with blonde hair and a nervous smile that she deployed frequently during our stilted conversation over chicken fingers and French fries. She asked Tommy and me careful questions about school and our hobbies, clearly coached by Dad on the safest topics to discuss. While I studied her face and tried to understand what it was about her that had made Dad willing to destroy our family. She wasn't extraordinarily beautiful or particularly charming, just an ordinary woman who laughed too loudly at Dad's jokes and kept reaching across the table to squeeze his hand in a way that made my skin crawl. Tommy, bless his innocent heart, was polite and curious, asking her about her job and her apartment and whether she liked the same cartoons he did. But I could barely manage to answer her questions with monosyllables, my throat tight with resentment and confusion that I was too young to fully articulate. After lunch, she suggested we go to the mall and maybe play some arcade games, an activity that would have thrilled me 6 months earlier, but now felt like another performance I was expected to participate in. I watched her and Dad walking together, their hands linked casually, and felt like I was observing aliens trying to mimic normal human behavior. At the arcade, she was competitive and playful, challenging Tommy to racing games and cheering when he won tickets from the skee-ball machine. She kept trying to include me in their activities, asking if I wanted to try the basketball shooting game or if I had enough quarters for the photo booth. But I couldn't bring myself to engage with her enthusiasm. This was the woman who had answered Dad's phone calls while we were supposed to be having our perfect family vacation, the person whose existence had turned our trip from a bonding experience into a charade. Later that evening, back at Dad's apartment, she helped him make dinner. While Tommy and I watched television in the living room, I could hear them talking and laughing in the kitchen, their voices blending in a way that suggested comfort and familiarity, a relationship that had clearly been developing for much longer than Dad had originally admitted. When Linda said goodbye, that night she hugged Tommy and told him she was so happy to finally meet him, then turned to me with a tentative smile and said she hoped we could be friends. I managed to nod and mutter something appropriate, but inside I was thinking that friendship required trust and respect, two things I would never be able to offer the woman who had helped tear my family apart. Spring brought new complications. As the divorce proceedings entered their final stages and my parents began making permanent decisions about custody arrangements and property division, the house that had been my childhood sanctuary was going to be sold. Mom explained one evening as we sat in the living room, surrounded by cardboard boxes and the detritus of a life being systematically dismantled. The memories embedded in these walls, the height marks on my bedroom doorframe, the dent in the kitchen wall where Tommy had thrown a toy truck during a tantrum when he was 3. All of these traces of our family history would soon belong to strangers who would paint over our lives and make this space their own. Mom had found a smaller house across town, closer to her job and in a good school district, she assured us, though the practical benefits of this move felt cold and insufficient compared to the loss of everything familiar. Dad and Linda, meanwhile, were talking about moving in together, a development that felt inevitable but still hit me like a physical blow when he mentioned it during one of our weekend visits. They had been looking at houses with extra bedrooms where Tommy and I could stay when we visited. Dad explained, his voice artificially bright as he described features like a finished basement, where we could play games in a backyard with a swing set, but I didn't want to play games in Linda's basement or swing on Linda's swing set. I wanted to go back to the life we had before that terrible trip, when my parents loved each other and our family felt solid and permanent instead of this fragile construction that could be dismantled by adult whims and poor decisions. The packing process was torture, each box a small burial of memories that I wasn't ready to let go of. Mom tried to make it into an adventure, playing music and ordering pizza and letting us keep more toys and books than we probably needed, but I could see the sadness in her eyes as she wrapped dishes and folded clothes and sorted through photo albums. She gave us each a memory box, a decorative container, where we could keep our most precious mementos from this house, but how do you fit an entire childhood into a shoebox? How do you preserve the feeling of safety and belonging that comes from living in the same place for your whole life? Tommy was excited about his new bedroom and the fact that the new house had a tire swing in the backyard. But I felt like I was mourning the death of everything I had thought was permanent and unchanging in my world. The move happened on a rainy Saturday in May, a dreary day that seemed appropriate for the melancholy task of relocating our fractured family to unfamiliar territory. Dad came to help with the heavy lifting, working alongside the professional movers in an awkward dance of politeness and careful distance. It was strange watching him navigate our old house with the formal courtesy of a helpful stranger, no longer moving through these rooms with the casual ownership of someone who belonged here. He and Mom spoke in clipped, businesslike sentences about logistics and timing, their conversation stripped of any personal warmth or shared history. Linda stayed away, a small mercy that I was grateful for, though her absence felt deliberately orchestrated rather than coincidental. At the new house, everything smelled like fresh paint and industrial carpet, sterile and unwelcoming compared to the lived-in comfort of our old home. My new bedroom was larger than my old one, but felt cavernous and cold, the windows facing a different direction so that the quality of light was all wrong. Tommy bounced from room to room with the adaptability of childhood, already planning where his toys would go and asking Mom if he could paint one wall of his room blue like the ocean. But I stood in the empty living room, surrounded by boxes, and feeling utterly displaced, wondering if this clinical space would ever feel like home, or if we would always be just visitors in our own lives. Mom worked with manic efficiency to unpack and organize, as if she could create comfort and belonging through sheer force of will. She hung familiar pictures on unfamiliar walls and arranged our furniture in configurations that approximated our old living spaces, but nothing looked quite right in this new context. The couch that had anchored our old living room looked lost and insignificant in the larger space, while the kitchen table where we had shared thousands of meals seemed too small for the dining area it now occupied. That first night in the new house, I lay in my strange new bedroom listening to unfamiliar sounds, the settling of different walls and the hum of an air conditioning unit that had a slightly different pitch than the one I was used to. The walls, I could hear Mom crying softly, the quiet, exhausted sobs of someone who had been holding herself together for months and finally had a moment of privacy to fall apart. I wanted to go to her, to offer comfort or at least companionship in her grief, but I was paralyzed by my own sorrow and confusion, too overwhelmed by my own losses to know how to help with hers. Summer in the new house was a series of adjustments and compromises as we all learned to navigate our reconfigured lives. Mom enrolled Tommy in day camp and signed me up for various activities designed to help us make friends and feel connected to our new neighborhood. But everything felt temporary and experimental, like we were all trying on different versions of ourselves to see what might fit. Dad's visits became more regularized now that the divorce was final, picking us up every other Friday evening and returning us Sunday night with the punctuality of a bus schedule. His relationship with Linda had solidified into something that looked like permanence, complete with shared checking accounts and vacation plans and casual references to future goals that included Tommy and me as permanent fixtures in their domestic landscape. I found myself caught between loyalty to Mom and the practical necessity of accepting Linda's presence in Dad's life, a balancing act that exhausted me with its complexity. Linda tried hard to win me over, remembering details about my interests and buying me books she thought I would like. But every kindness felt like a bribery attempt, every gesture of affection tainted by the circumstances of how she had entered our lives. Tommy, with the uncomplicated emotional processing of childhood, had begun to genuinely like her, enjoying her attention and the special activities she planned for our visits. This created another layer of guilt for me as I watched my little brother bond with the woman I still thought of as the architect of our family's destruction while I remained stubbornly resistant to her charms. At home with Mom, I became increasingly protective and helpful, taking on responsibilities that had once belonged to Dad and trying to be the stable presence that Tommy needed in his life. I helped with laundry and grocery shopping, read him bedtime stories when Mom was working late, and generally tried to fill the gaps left by her father's absence. Mom seemed grateful for my maturity, but also worried about it, occasionally urging me to spend more time with friends my own age instead of shouldering adult burdens that weren't meant to be mine. But I couldn't explain to her that taking care of our small family felt like the only way I could maintain some control in a life that had become unpredictable and chaotic. That being helpful was my way of ensuring that no more disasters would befall us if I just worked hard enough to prevent them. By the time school started in the fall, I had become an expert at managing the complicated logistics of my divided life. I kept separate calendars for Mom's house and Dad's house, different sets of clothes and school supplies at each location, and careful mental notes about which parent knew what information about my daily activities. The constant switching between households required a kind of emotional flexibility that felt unnatural but necessary, like learning to speak two different languages depending on my audience. My grades suffered as I struggled to concentrate on homework and tests while mentally processing the ongoing drama of adult relationships and custody schedules. Teachers noticed my distraction but attributed it to typical teenage moodiness, offering gentle encouragement about time management and study habits without recognizing the deeper issues that were affecting my academic performance. At Dad and Linda's house, they had created a bedroom for me that was decorated in colors they thought I would like, with posters and furniture chosen to reflect their understanding of my personality. But sleeping in that room felt like wearing clothes that didn't quite fit, technically adequate, but never comfortable. Linda continued her efforts to build a relationship with me, asking about my friends and my classes and my hopes for the future. But every conversation felt like a job interview where I was being evaluated for the position of willing stepdaughter. She never pushed too hard or demanded affection I wasn't ready to give, which I grudgingly respected even as I maintained my emotional distance. Meanwhile, Tommy was thriving in this new configuration, enjoying the novelty of having two different homes with two different sets of rules and routines. He had started calling Linda by her first name without any prompting, and I watched him climb into her lap during movie nights with an ease that I envied and resented in equal measure. His adaptability made my own rigidity feel petty and immature, but I couldn't seem to soften my heart enough to accept the woman who had fundamentally altered the trajectory of our family's story. Asterisk now. 5 years later, as I prepared to graduate from high school and leave for college, I find myself reflecting on that trip that changed everything and wondering what might have been different if I had never pressed my ear against that motel wall. Would my parents have found a way to work through their problems if their crisis hadn't been witnessed by their 12-year-old daughter? Would I have been able to maintain my childhood innocence a little longer if I hadn't been forced to become the keeper of family secrets and the guardian of my little brother's emotional well-being? These questions feel unanswerable now. Academic exercises in alternate history that can't change the path we actually traveled. What I do know is that the family trip that ended my childhood also began my education in resilience and adaptation. Taught me that love can be messy and imperfect and still worth fighting for. Mom found happiness again, eventually, with a kind man named Robert who treats her with the respect and devotion she deserves. Dad and Linda got married 3 years ago in a small ceremony that Tommy and I attended with complicated feelings but genuine wishes for their success. I've learned to appreciate Linda's steadfast presence in our lives, her patience with my adolescent hostility, and her genuine care for Tommy's well-being. She'll never be my mother, but she's become something else, a steady adult figure who has earned her place in our unconventional family through years of consistent kindness and reliability. As I pack for college, sorting through the accumulated possessions of my teenage years, I find the journal I had brought on that fateful trip. Its pages still mostly blank, except for the first few entries written in my 12-year-old handwriting, full of excitement about the adventures we were going to have together. I think about that girl I used to be, so naive and trusting, and I feel a complicated mix of mourning for her innocence and pride in the young woman she became through necessity and circumstance. That trip didn't end the way any of us expected, but maybe that's the most important lesson it taught me, that families can break and rebuild themselves in new configurations, that love can survive even the most devastating betrayals, and that sometimes the most painful experiences become the foundation for deeper wisdom and stronger connections. Tomorrow, I leave for college, ready to write the next chapter of my story with the knowledge that I can survive whatever plot twists life throws at me, because I already have.